Now, the numerous delays in former President Jacob Zuma's arms deal trial may escalate further. An episode of one of South Africa's longest-running court cases played out today in the Pietermaritzburg, High Court, and has since been postponed to February next year. The 17th of October was meant to give interested parties an indication whether the trial will kick off on the 7th of November. Joining us now for insight is Hennie van Vuuren, Director at Open Secrets. Hennie, good to have you with us, and thank you very much for your time once again. And how do you read the current situation? Do you see this as, I suppose, another delay in the arms deal matter?
Yeah, good evening, Thabo. I think certainly we see this as more of the same Stalingrad strategy from the defense team of both former President Jacob Zuma and, of course, the beneficiaries of this strategy, which is Thales, the big French arms company, who stands in the dock with former President Zuma, accused of very serious economic crimes. Clearly, this attempt to turn the prosecution, and the law allows for that, for the president to try and turn the spotlight on the prosecutor and on a journalist, a senior journalist, Karyn Maughan, is something that we haven't yet seen in South Africa before. We've never seen at least a head of state try and launch a prosecution in this manner against a senior officer of the court, a prosecutor like Advocate Billy Downer, who has extensive experience, and of course a very senior journalist who's been reporting on the matter. And you know, Thabo, I guess the point is what we've learned over the last few days, although the matter hasn't been in court, it does seem that even President Zuma's counsel, Advocate Dali Mpofu, and others have been sharing information very openly via WhatsApp with Karyn Maughan, for example. So there's been this flow of information that's been taking place on the case and on some of these matters. Much of this record was in fact in the public domain, and I think there's a good reason to argue that the public does have a right to know some of the material, some of this information as to why there were requests for postponements and so on. But very clearly, I think it's a targeted strategy to undermine the public's confidence in the judicial process by President Zuma and his legal team, very clearly, who are developing the strategy together with him. And I think it's a very dangerous game, to politicize our judiciary in the manner that we see unfolding at the moment.
So the matter, of course, at hand is the arms deal, which is a matter that's been there for decades now, failing to get to a resolution. Just highlight for us, what are the key issues in that arms deal case that, of course, has now dragged on for so long?
Yeah, so I think we get caught up in the micro moments of these. As the Stalingrad strategy plays itself out, or the prosecutions rather, we get caught up in the micro moments. But we forget that it is part of a much bigger corruption scandal that was buried, if you like, by the many crimes of state capture. The late 1990s, South Africa procured weapons from international arms dealers. Those weapons civil society argued the country didn't need, it couldn't afford. And we spent in the region of about 142 billion rand in today's rand value buying weapons, which we only paid off, Thabo, 2 years ago. And those weapons were aeroplanes, fighter jets, trainer jets, submarines and frigates. And of course the systems on the frigates are the ones that the French arms company Thales were awarded a contract for, which was linked to bribery. But Thales, the French arms company who is alleged to have corrupted Jacob Zuma, wasn't the only arms company involved. British Aerospace from the United Kingdom is knee-deep in allegations of corruption involving people like General Simpiwe Nyanda, Fana Hlongwane, and a range of other individuals, and potentially funding to the ANC as a party as well. The Swedish arms company Saab linked to corruption, and of course some of the very biggest German arms companies again linked to corruption. In each instance, and of course an Italian arms company, in each instance, Thabo, what was clear and what we've been able to show over many years is that the arms companies worked very closely with middlemen in South Africa to ensure that South Africa bought weapons that were much more expensive than the country needed. And as I said, we couldn't afford it at that time. We were not buying antiretroviral medicine, which resulted in the loss of 300,000 fellow South Africans who lost their lives, so that we could buy these weapons in these very corrupt transactions, led by politicians like Thabo Mbeki at the time, but clearly enabled by these very big and these large arms companies. And I think maybe the point to make, Thabo, is that the importance of this type of activity, this type of corruption that these arms companies are involved in, their knowledge that they can simply buy off politicians willy-nilly has meant that they've also fought tooth and nail to make sure that there has been no successful prosecution to date. So in a way, we're dealing with very South African problems of political elites who are fighting against their prosecution. Yeah. We're also dealing with a global network of players who do this kind of thing all across the globe, but particularly in countries in Africa and elsewhere. They do that to undermine democracy, and they have an interest to ensure that that system prevails, a very corrupt system that has benefited very wealthy arms companies over many years.
So it's been argued over and over by former President Jacob Zuma, and I paraphrase, not his exact words, but in essence what he's saying is that Billy Downer is not necessarily an objective party here. He's very too biased. He's personal, and in fact to the point where he says he even shared very important medical records of myself with journalists, and hence we are at this point. And he's been raising this point. It's been through our courts. Courts have pronounced on it to a point where the NPA is saying we are not going to prosecute, and now he's going the private prosecution route. Can this matter go ahead without Billy Downer? If Billy Downer, for example, in this private prosecution matter is found guilty, can he play no further role in this matter?
I think we need to see what the courts decide. I would be somewhat surprised if he were to be found guilty, Thabo, but were he to be found guilty, I think it would be a great prize for former President Zuma and his legal team. Removing Billy Downer is crucial. And let's remind ourselves rather of the context. Downer has been with the NPA for very many years and had been part of the legal team in the 2000s under the leadership of former head of the NPA, the National Director of Public Prosecutions at the time, Bulelani Ngcuka. And Downer was tasked with leading some of the very important aspects of the prosecution of various arms deal matters in the mid-2000s. He has an extraordinary institutional knowledge. He understands the ins and outs of these cases, and he has, of course, prosecuted a man who was the former financial advisor to President Jacob Zuma, Schabir Shaik, in the same corruption matter in the mid-2000s. And, of course, Schabir Shaik was found guilty and, as we know, in a way sprung out of jail by the system because he claimed he was on death's door. And today, I'm told, he's still to be found on Durban's golf courses. But that was the effectiveness of Downer at the time. And I think that the risk for people like, or corporations like Thales, for former President Jacob Zuma and his legal team, is that they have a very knowledgeable advocate who's leading the state's case and is therefore very dangerous to them. And maybe, Thabo, for us to remember, one of the important elements of state capture under the leadership of President Jacob Zuma during the state capture year was the destruction of the National Prosecuting Authority. We haven't seen that capacity rebuilt in the manner it should be within the NPA to date. There have been some moves, for example, on the state capture matters, but in fact, even under the leadership of Advocate Shamala Batoy, the NPA has underperformed in its ability to tackle high-level, sophisticated economic crimes. Now, some of those are certainly legacy issues. Others are just they're not assembling the right teams, and frankly, it puts a question mark on the leadership of institutions like those. I think we need to ask them hard questions. But it does beg the question, as you say, if Downer is removed, that card is removed from the table, I think it is going to make it potentially a lot easier for President Jacob Zuma's legal team, because you remove someone with such extraordinary institutional knowledge, and that, after all, is the aim of the current strategy. I think is quite clear.
The ANC chairperson in the KwaZulu-Natal province says while freedom of speech, freedom of media is upheld by the African National Congress, but we've got to be careful of overreach. Do you think the journalists could have overreached here?
Well, I would say that political elites who've been involved in corruption that has that has stolen the livelihoods of ordinary South Africans, whether it's the nearly 2 million South Africans who were driven into poverty as a result of state capture. We've spoken about the arms deal, our decision as a country to buy those weapons when people like Jacob Zuma and Trevor Manuel and a whole range of politicians, including Thabo Mbeki, made decisions that we bought those weapons. That, as we, I think it is very clear, we made some clear calculations in this country. Our elected leaders did, and in which they said they were not going to provide antiretroviral medication, as I've said, and that resulted in the loss of hundreds of thousands of vulnerable fellow South Africans. So it's all good and well for politicians in the governing party to make pronouncements like that. But I think that the first and foremost in our minds need to be the kind of loss and damage that has been suffered by fellow South Africans. And then we need to recognize that who has enriched themselves. It's a political class. It's a small, very small political class who have destroyed very powerful movements like the African National Congress from within. And certainly they have been driven by these very large multinational corporations, most of whom are in Europe, and who have very little interest in the future of a democratic South Africa. If anything, I think there's a good reason to argue that many of those arms companies would prefer an African country that, like South Africa, to be on its knees, to have a corrupt leadership that buys things from them continuously that we'll never need, and to move our scarce resources away from the people who deserve that, the majority of South Africa's people. And therein, I think, lies the danger. So I do think we must be cautious with the way in which some of these arguments are made, and they are meant, I would argue, to distract us from the real crimes and from the impact that those crimes have had on millions of South Africans in horrific manners.
Hennie van Vuuren, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on, joining us tonight here on In Focus. We'll continue.